Fast food workers, what's the moment you realized your customer genuinely belonged on a watch list? I worked the night shift at a fast food place right off a highway exit, the kind of location where truckers, exhausted parents, and people making questionable life choices at 2 a.m. all collide under fluorescent lights. It was already a weird night because the ice cream machine was somehow working, which felt like tempting fate, and the lobby was empty except for one guy sitting alone in a booth just staring at the menu like it had personally wronged him. He didn't look threatening at first, just intensely focused, like he was trying to memorize the menu instead of ordering food from it. When he finally came up to the counter, he leaned in way too close and whispered his order, even though there was absolutely no one else around to overhear us. He asked if our chicken sandwiches were traceable. I laughed because I assumed he was joking, and said something dumb like, traceable to the fryer? He did not laugh back. Instead, he asked if our supply chain was federal or private, and that's when my brain started quietly turning on its hazard lights. I told him I was just a cashier and didn't really know anything about that, which apparently was the wrong answer because he squinted at me like I'd failed a test. Then he asked if we kept security footage, and how long we stored it, and whether it was uploaded locally or externally. At this point, my manager was in the back. The drive-through headset was screaming, and I was stuck alone trying to explain that I just put burgers in bags. He ordered a plain cheeseburger, but insisted it be wrapped separately from everything else because he didn't want cross-contamination of identifiers. I asked what that meant, and he said food absorbs environmental information, which honestly should have been my cue to fake a fire alarm. While I rang him up, he casually mentioned that he never uses credit cards because patterns get people caught, and then paid in exact change that he pulled from 3 different pockets. He sat back down in the lobby and didn't eat immediately, which I noticed because people who are hungry at 2 a.m. do not wait, they inhale. Instead, he pulled out a notebook and started writing while staring at the staff door, stopping occasionally to glance at the security camera in the corner. When my manager came out, the guy immediately stood up and asked if he was the ranking authority on site, which is not a sentence normal customers use. My manager, bless him, thought this was just a weird prank and told him he was the shift supervisor, which caused the guy to visibly relax like he'd confirmed something important. He asked my manager what time the dumpsters were taken out and whether anyone ever went back there alone. That was the exact moment my manager looked at me with wide eyes and mouthed, "What the hell?" The guy then asked if employees ever took food home at the end of the night and whether bags were inspected before leaving. I realized my hands were shaking because my brain had gone from eccentric weirdo to this is how documentaries start. The final straw came when he asked if the building had blueprints online and whether renovations had changed the original layout. My manager told him we couldn't answer those questions and asked if everything was okay, trying to sound calm but failing a little. The guy smiled in this unsettling, too controlled way and said he just liked to know his environments thoroughly. He finally took a bite of the cheeseburger, chewed slowly, and then stopped like he'd made a decision. He asked if we ever had gas leaks. My manager said no, and the guy nodded like he'd crossed something off an invisible checklist. He threw away the rest of his food without finishing it, which is a crime in itself at that hour, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned around and told us, very politely, that we should rotate which employee locks up at night to avoid predictability. Then he left. We locked the doors immediately even though it was still technically open hours. My manager called corporate security who told us to file an incident report, which we did while nervously replaying everything he'd said. Nothing ever happened after that night. No news stories, no police reports, nothing. But every single one of us who worked that shift had the same feeling, which was that we hadn't just met a weird guy, we had intersected with someone's unfinished plan. For months afterward, anytime someone asked a slightly odd question, my heart rate spiked like I was about to be interviewed for a true crime podcast. I still work customer service, and I've dealt with screaming customers, scammers, and people who think coupons are legally binding documents. But that guy remains the only customer who made me think, genuinely and without exaggeration, yeah, This person is absolutely on someone's watch list, or should be. Sometimes the scariest customers aren't loud or angry or dramatic, but calm, curious, and taking mental notes while pretending to order a cheeseburger. I worked the late shift at a 24-hour burger place off the highway, the kind with flickering menu boards and a soda machine that screamed like a dying animal every time you pulled a lever. Most nights were drunk college kids, truckers with 1,000-yard stares, and the occasional raccoon bold enough to test the automatic doors. Then there was him, who walked in at 1:47 a.m. and immediately made the room feel smaller, like the air itself wanted to clock out early. He wore a long coat even though it was August, and it wasn't a cool long coat. It was this coat has pockets you don't ask about long coat. He didn't look homeless or rich or anything obvious, just aggressively neutral, like a man who practiced not being remembered. He stood directly under the security camera and stared at the menu for a full 3 minutes without blinking, which is a long time when the only sound is the fryer popping and my coworker chewing ice. When he finally spoke, he asked if our chicken nuggets were traceable. I laughed because I thought it was a joke, but he didn't laugh back, and that was mistake number 1 on my part. He clarified by asking if the nuggets had serial batch numbers or if they were individually distinguishable. I told him they came frozen in a bag with a cartoon chicken on it, which felt like the safest possible answer. He nodded slowly, like I had just confirmed a theory he already believed. Then he asked if our soda cups were recyclable, in a way that leaves no personal residue. I glanced at my manager, who was pretending very hard to clean the same counter spot over and over while listening with his whole soul. The man leaned closer to the counter and lowered his voice, even though there was literally no one else in the restaurant. He asked if we rotated staff frequently or if patterns formed over time. At this point, my brain had stopped producing thoughts and was just playing elevator music. I told him our schedules changed weekly because people kept quitting, which was true and also felt like a warning. He smiled for the first time, and I immediately wished he hadn't. He ordered 1 plain burger, no condiments, cut in half, but wrapped as a single item. When I asked why, he said it was for symmetry purposes, which did not clarify anything at all. While we waited for the food, he asked if the cameras recorded audio or just video, and whether the footage was stored locally or sent elsewhere. My manager suddenly remembered he needed to check the freezer inventory and vanished like a cartoon character leaving a dust outline. The man tapped the counter in a rhythm that felt intentional, like Morse code for "you should have called in sick." When I handed him the food, he inspected the wrapper like it might bite him. He asked if I had touched the burger directly or if it had only been handled with tools. I told him we used gloves, which was a lie because the gloves ran out an hour earlier and we were all pretending not to notice. He stared at my hands for a long second, then nodded again like he was updating a mental spreadsheet. Instead of sitting at a table, he stood near the exit and ate half the burger while watching the parking lot through the glass. Every time a car passed, his shoulders tensed like he was counting license plates. He left the other half of the burger untouched and placed it carefully into a napkin, which he folded with unsettling precision. Before leaving, he asked what time our trash got taken out and whether it was mixed with neighboring businesses. I said I didn't know, because I truly did not want to know the answer to that question anymore. He thanked me for my cooperation, which is a word you don't want to hear in a fast food context. Then he pulled out a small notebook, wrote something down while looking directly at me, and slid it back into his coat. He paused at the door and asked if we ever had unplanned inspections. I said only when corporate remembered we existed. That made him laugh, a sharp single sound, like a bark that had learned English. After he left, the restaurant felt louder, messier, and strangely safer, like we'd just survived a weather event. My manager came back out and asked if that guy was normal. And we all laughed in the way people laugh after narrowly avoiding disaster. We checked the cameras and realized he had never once looked at the food while ordering, only at reflections in the glass. The next night, a police officer came in asking if we'd seen a man matching his description. Apparently, he'd been going into late-night businesses, asking logistics questions, and leaving without committing any actual crime. The officer told us not to worry because he hadn't done anything illegal, which somehow made it worse. For weeks afterward, every customer in a coat felt like a threat assessment. I started noticing cameras everywhere, counting exits, wondering if that's how paranoia starts, or if it's contagious. Sometimes I'd find myself checking whether cups were traceable and hate myself for it. A month later, I found a napkin folded exactly like his in the parking lot, with no writing on it at all. I threw it away using gloves, which we finally had again, and washed my hands longer than necessary. Nothing ever happened after that. No big reveal, no arrest, no follow-up. But every time someone asks a slightly too specific question at the counter, my stomach drops back into that place. I don't know what he was planning, or if he was planning anything at all, which honestly might be worse. All I know is that some people don't come into fast food restaurants hungry. Some people come in to test systems, observe routines, and see who notices. And once you realize that, you never quite look at a plain burger the same way again. I worked the overnight shift at a 24-hour burger place off the highway, the kind of location that feels like a confessional booth for humanity's worst impulses after midnight. By 2 a.m., you learn to read people the way sailors read clouds, because certain vibes mean drunks, some mean crying, and some mean you quietly text your manager to stay in the office. The guy who made me think this man belongs on a watch list walked in at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, which is already a cursed time to exist. He was wearing a long black trench coat despite it being July, and he paused in the doorway like he was scanning exits rather than menus. Instead of looking at the overhead board like a normal human, he stared directly at the security camera above the soda fountain for a full 10 seconds without blinking. I remember thinking maybe he was just high because overnight shifts condition you to assume substances before malice. Then he pulled out a notebook, not a phone, not a receipt, but a literal spiral notebook, and began writing while slowly pacing the lobby. My coworker whispered that he looked like a villain from a low-budget crime documentary, and I told her to stop talking because my brain was already sprinting. When he finally came to the counter, he leaned in close enough that I could smell motor oil and peppermint gum at the same time. He asked me what time we rotate the fry oil and whether it was done manually or automatically, which is not a question customers ever ask. I answered vaguely because I was 19 and terrified and had not been trained for interrogation. He nodded like he was confirming a hypothesis and wrote it down carefully, underlining something twice. Then he asked how many people were usually on shift overnight, whether anyone ever worked alone, and how often the back door was used for deliveries. At this point, my fight-or-flight response had chosen freeze while smiling politely, which is my signature move. My manager came out of the office sensing danger like an exhausted meerkat, and the guy immediately shifted tone like a switch flipped. He ordered one black coffee, no lid, no cream, no sugar, and paid in exact change that looked like it had been sorted beforehand. While the coffee brewed, he asked my manager if the cameras recorded audio or just video, phrasing it like casual curiosity. My manager laughed nervously and said, "Just video, man," which was absolutely the wrong answer but too late to retrieve. The guy smiled for the first time, and it was the kind of smile that feels like being measured. He sat in the corner booth with his back to the wall, notebook open, coffee untouched, and watched the counter non-stop. Every time the door chimed, he flinched slightly and adjusted his coat like he was checking for something underneath. A drunk couple stumbled in, arguing about fries, and the guy paused his writing to stare at them with visible irritation, like they were ruining his timeline. At one point, he got up and timed how long it took someone to wash their hands in the bathroom, because I could see him watching the clock through the reflection. I wish I were exaggerating, but this is exactly how it happened, and it only got worse. He came back to the counter 30 minutes later and asked if we ever had incidents overnight, making air quotes like he was asking about ghost sightings. My manager said something about rowdy teens, and the guy nodded slowly, writing again, muttering pattern holds under his breath. That phrase alone shaved years off my life expectancy. Then he asked if the fire exits were ever alarmed during normal operations, or only when opened forcefully. I dropped a cup and it shattered because my hands finally gave up pretending to function. The guy looked at the broken cup, then at me, and said very calmly that accidents escalate situations unnecessarily. My manager told him we were closing the lobby for cleaning, which was a lie, but a necessary one. The guy accepted this with unsettling grace and packed up his notebook like he had finished an exam. Before leaving, he walked up to the counter and asked for my name, spelling it back to me slowly to confirm. I lied immediately, using my coworker's name without thinking, and she shot me a look that could kill. He thanked me for my cooperation and said we ran a remarkably predictable operation. As he walked out, he stopped at the door, turned around, and said, "Routine is a vulnerability," like he was sharing a life hack. The door closed behind him, and the entire restaurant exhaled at once. We locked the lobby for real this time and watched him stand outside writing more notes under the streetlight. He circled the building twice, counting something on his fingers, before finally getting into a van with no side windows. My manager immediately called corporate security, which I did not know existed until that moment. They asked us to write incident reports, and reading mine later made me realize my handwriting looked like I'd been fleeing a fire. The next night, corporate sent a memo reminding us not to disclose security procedures to customers, which felt very too little, too late. A week later, a detective came in asking if we remembered a man matching that description. Apparently, he had been conducting informal reconnaissance of several overnight businesses in the area. The detective would not elaborate, which somehow made everything worse. We never saw the guy again, but I still think about him every time someone asks a weirdly specific question. I stopped working nights not long after, citing school reasons that were only partially true. To this day, when someone orders black coffee and exact change, my spine stiffens automatically. I know people joke about customers belonging on watch lists, but that night taught me the difference between eccentric and operational. There is a unique terror in realizing someone isn't just strange, but methodical. I still work retail, and I've seen plenty of unhinged behavior since then, but nothing that quiet, focused, and deliberate. What haunts me most isn't that he might have planned something terrible, but that he treated our minimum wage chaos like a case study. Sometimes I wonder if my fake name ended up in that notebook, attached to bullet points and arrows. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd answered differently. And sometimes at 3 a.m., I remember him smiling at the camera and feel very grateful that some instincts kick in before training ever does. I worked the night shift at a 24-hour burger place right off the highway, the kind of place where truckers, drunks, and people who definitely shouldn't be awake at 3 a.m. all converge. One night, a guy came in wearing sunglasses, which already felt wrong because it was pitch black outside and raining, and he didn't take them off even when he ordered. He spoke calmly, too calmly, and asked for a single black coffee, then leaned on the counter instead of stepping aside like normal humans do. While I was pouring the coffee, he started asking questions that didn't sound like questions at first, more like casual observations. He said things like, "You guys don't have many cameras back here," and "That hallway probably doesn't get monitored much, huh?" I laughed awkwardly and said I wouldn't know because I just worked the register, which was true, but my stomach already felt tight. He nodded like I'd just confirmed something important, and then asked what time our manager usually came in. I tried to redirect by handing him his coffee and telling him the total, but he didn't even look at the cup. Instead, he asked if the cameras recorded audio too, and when I said I didn't think so, he smiled in a way that felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in a mirror. He finally paid an exact change, which he laid out slowly, one coin at a time, while maintaining eye contact through the sunglasses. Before leaving, he asked me if the emergency exit alarm was loud or more of a formality, and when I froze instead of answering, he laughed and said, "Relax, just curious," like people always say when they definitely aren't just curious. He left without taking the coffee, which sat on the counter getting cold, and then sat in his car for a full 20 minutes without moving. My manager showed up early that morning, and I told him everything, and he went pale in a way I've never seen before. Turns out the guy had been asking similar questions at multiple locations in the area, always late at night, always about cameras and staffing. Nothing ever happened, but I still think about how calm he was, like he wasn't planning something yet, just checking boxes. This was during my first job ever, at a sandwich shop, and I didn't trust my instincts back then the way I do now. A man came in with a notebook and sat in the corner without ordering for a long time, just writing and occasionally looking up. When I asked if he needed help, he said he was studying flow, which I assumed was for school or something equally boring. Eventually he ordered, but even then, he kept asking questions about when deliveries arrived, how often police stopped by, and whether the Wi-Fi cameras were internal only. He asked if we had ever been robbed, and when I said no, he looked disappointed in a way that made my skin crawl. He timed how long customers spent inside and noted which employees went outside to smoke. Before leaving, he asked me if I felt safe working there, which is a loaded question to ask a teenager making minimum wage sandwiches. A week later, we got an email warning us about a guy doing reconnaissance-style observation at multiple locations, and suddenly everything clicked into place. He wasn't just weird, he was evaluating, and that realization hit way harder than any openly aggressive customer ever had.